Hello, I'm Andrew Davis of Durham University. Contemporary education features many ways of categorising learners. Some of these classifications relate to learning problems or disorders. Examples include dyslexia, ADHD, dyspraxia, and conduct disorder. I'm going to raise some questions about the status of these categories. Do dyslexia or ADHD exist in the same way as illnesses or chemical elements? There is much debate about this. The Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking is a key player here. I will draw on his thinking a good deal in what follows. One of my colleagues is Julian Joe Elliott. We taught together for some years and have shared a book project. Some years back, he was involved in more than one TV broadcast about dyslexia. Let's introduce him via a little video extract.
Research, though, now suggests that the common view of dyslexia is a myth. Until now, only academics have been aware of the new findings, but now they're reaching teachers. Here, Durham University is holding a conference to tell them that almost everything they believe about dyslexia is wrong.
People, if you talk to the lay public and you ask them about dyslexia, they'll say it's something to do with vision.
In Durham, teachers who face the anguish of such parents every day hear Professor Elliott begin with the most commonly held view of all.
The letters are hopping around all over the page. Or
the suggestion that dyslexics see words differently, which explains why they make mistakes like reversing letters, has led many parents to buy special glasses and other aids to help children overcome the problem.
Lots of these kinds of ideas about reversibility, various...
Yet most researchers now believe that dyslexics can see just as well, or just as badly, as the rest of us.
In other words,
having heard that dyslexia is not caused by poor coordination nor poor vision, teachers in Durham are about to hear something just as surprising. Academics say there is no way of even distinguishing dyslexics from any other poor readers.
I've been in clinical practice 20 years, and if someone came in with a child now and said to me, "Can you tell me whether this kid is dyslexic or not?" I wouldn't have the faintest idea how to do it. We can't afford to ignore the evidence that's in front of us. If we're going to have a scientific approach, then we can't allow ourselves to come up with pseudo-terms which are meaningless.
What it boils down to is that when it comes to reading, either all children with a serious problem are dyslexic, or none of them is. Some of the teachers at the Durham conference are unhappy with what they've heard.
Would you say that dyslexia doesn't exist?
What I say is I can't define it, and I couldn't tell you if I saw a dyslexic person what they would be.
Maybe you should spend a day with a dyslexic person and
I spent 30 years with kids with reading difficulties. Dyslexia, I see them, my kids come to me all the time, I do assessments with them all the time, but there is no clear way in my head, and the more I've read and the more I've looked at the studies, there's no clear way that I can differentiate between them.
Isn't this going to cause massive anxiety for parents who are going to watch this programme? Because that would be my concern. We work with parents who have fought for years to get their child support, to get them a diagnosis, to get them a statement. What's this kind of message going to give out to people? It's going to say there's no such thing as dyslexia. There's no such thing. You're going to have a whole load of anxious parents now ringing up the school, frantically saying, he has got dyslexia, hasn't he? You're not going to take away his support.
What are you saying? We keep quiet about what we know about this topic now. We hush it up. We just write it in scientific journals, and we don't say anything about that to the public anymore.
A characteristic quotation from Joe, quote, "Experts have failed to agree what dyslexia is, and being diagnosed as dyslexic makes virtually no difference to the treatment that the individual requires." End of quote. Now, let's sample some of the things Joe's opponents had to say. the British Dyslexia Association. Quote, "Dyslexia is primarily an information processing difficulty, neurological in origin and affecting language. Dyslexia survives as a term because it is a real condition. In excess of 1 million people download information every month. Is he suggesting that they are all suffering from some kind of emotional delusion?" And Dyslexia Action, a charity, said, quote, "Julian Elliott is plain wrong. We know dyslexia has a genetic basis." End of quote. Joe had hate mail and complaints to Ofcom about the dyslexia myth. He said he was surprised about this. This is, of course, a high-stakes issue. Students with learning difficulties often endure much frustration and even misery. We want to help them. But I am frequently puzzled by the assertions and apparent assumptions on either side of these debates. The protagonists obviously think they know what they are supporting and denying. But the more I look at it, the more obstacles I discover to becoming clear about verdicts either way. Maybe, just maybe, there are some false dichotomies lurking here. By the end of this session, I hope you will have increased your levels of informed uncertainty. I want first to draw some parallels between debates about the status of mental health labels and the status of learning disability labels. These go back at least as far as the middle of the last century. We have a medical model of psychiatric disorders versus the so-called anti-psychiatry movement associated with Thomas Satz and R.D. Laing. Anti-psychiatry held that it was wrong to think of mental health problems, say schizophrenia, as illnesses that individuals have and suffer. We should think of them instead as involving dysfunctional relationships between individuals and others, especially their families. Here are crude sketches of extreme positions that might be held by protagonists in these debates. At least some psychiatric disorders really exist. No psychiatric disorders really exist. They are merely constructions involving classifications of people that fail to reflect objective reality. Perhaps we might think about learning disorders in a similar way and sketch corresponding positions. At least some learner categories reflect real differences between learners. No learner categories reflect real differences between learners. They are merely constructions involving classifications of people that fail to reflect objective reality. Note, in passing, a couple of sources commenting on the incidence of so-called learning disabilities. They feel they know what it is for these conditions to exist. They even offer a verdict on the proportion of the population who suffer from such conditions. An NHS website recently accessed says, quote, Dyslexia is a common learning difficulty that can cause problems with reading, writing and spelling. It's a specific learning difficulty, which means it causes problems with certain abilities used for learning, such as reading and writing. It's estimated up to 1 in 10 people in the UK has some degree of dyslexia. End of quote. In a similar spirit, here are researchers commenting on the status of ADHD. Grimm, Krantz and Reif, 2020, say, quote, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, is a developmental disorder with symptoms of inattentiveness, impulsiveness and hyperactivity, which leads to impairments in everyday life and manifests before the age of 12. ADHD has a worldwide prevalence of 5 to 7% of school-aged children. End of quote. First impressions are that they are going for a biological cum medical construal of what it means for these conditions to exist. So let's turn to the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking, insightful on the way we classify people and the status of these classifications. First, he talks about indifferent kinds. Think of the periodic table of the elements. Chemical elements are unaware of being classified. Nothing about how they are classified can make a difference to their inherent properties. They are what they are and would be what they are, even had no human beings ever existed to classify them. Hence their label of indifferent kinds. Next, Hacking's humankinds. Humankind, Ian Hacking's term for the kinds of people, working class, child abusers, pregnant teenagers, the unemployed, studied by the human sciences. Then we have biologized kinds. Hacking talks about these in his essay, The Looping Effects of Humankind. He says, quote, there is an old and powerful idea that we acquire knowledge of humanity by replacing humankinds by physiological or mechanical or neuroelectrical or biomechanical ones. What kind of evidence is used as the basis for biologizing? For instance, if we're into biologizing schizophrenia, the risk in the general population is said to be 1%. For relatives of the affected person, they are, for a non-twin sibling, 8%. For a child of parent with schizophrenia, 12%. Fraternal twin is 12%, and a child of two parents with schizophrenia has a risk of 40%, and identical twins have a risk of 47%. We also often get structural brain imaging evidence. Now, for Hacking's interactive kinds. These are particularly interesting and important for my reflections here. Hacking says, people are affected by how they are categorized. In turn, people themselves affect how they are categorized. Interactive kinds involve these looping effects. Hacking says, we think of these kinds of people as given as definite classes defined by definite properties, but they are in fact moving targets because our investigations interact with the targets themselves and change them. That is the looping effect. Sometimes our sciences create kinds of people that in a certain sense did not exist before. That is making up people. Hacking thinks that, for example, high-functioning autism is something that has been made up. It has become a way of being a person, a way of experiencing and of being in society. The interactions involved in making up this way of being embrace institutions, patterns of behaviour on the part of relevant professionals, and much else. Now, the phrase making up might seem to suggest a fiction, an invention without a basis in reality. But hacking tries to avoid the crude dichotomies which might underlie such thinking. Once made up, categories acquire a kind of reality. He also points to cases which are significantly made up, but special cases of which might have a biological basis. Obesity, for instance. Let's look at autism and Asperger's for a moment. Certainly, the relevant labels are shifting. You must judge whether this fact supports hacking here. We can be pretty sure that parents and children have interacted with these labels, and we do know that the criteria are shifting over time. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4, DSM-4, identified a whole set of pervasive developmental disorders. All these were considered autism spectrum disorders, ASDs. They included autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. But in DSM-5, the distinct diagnostic labels of autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise classified were replaced by one umbrella term, autistic spectrum disorder. The DSM-5 revision website said the reasons for using the revised umbrella term of autistic spectrum disorder were 1. The old way wasn't precise enough. 2. Different clinicians diagnosed the same person with different disorders, and some changed their diagnosis of the same symptoms differently from year to year. And autism is defined by a common set of behaviours, and it should be characterised by a single name according to severity. The removal of the formal diagnoses of Asperger's disorder and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise classified was a major change. People who currently hold these diagnoses received a different diagnosis when re-evaluated. This had the potential to be confusing for parents of children with these diagnoses, as well as children and adults who identify strongly with their diagnosis. So, hacking's interactive kinds, some examples of interaction. This is an example from Hacking's book, The Social Construction of What. He imagines a behaviour modification program to diminish symptoms and feelings of depression. Quote, numerous kinds of behaviour are reinforced, all of which run counter to the classification depressed. By living in this new way, a certain chemical condition of the brain thought to be correlated with depression is alleviated. And this video clip may show another example of how environmental features may cause brain changes rather than brain events being the cause of behaviours that include learning problems.
Up. In. Cat.
The breakthrough came when they scanned the brains of children both before and after they were given help with their reading problems. After as little as 8 weeks of intensive one-to-one tuition, they found the brains of these children had changed, and changed dramatically. This is the scan of one child's brain before he'd received help with his reading. And this is his brain afterwards. This is another child before, and after, and another. These scans, which are believed to show normalization of brain function, have big implications. They mean that when it comes to reading, the neurological strengths and weaknesses children are born with are only the beginning of the story.
Effective instruction alters brain function. So these neural systems are plastic, they're malleable, they are sensitive to the effects of the environment.
So, we might get neurological changes as a result of teaching. Bear this possibility in mind when we think of the kind of evidence adduced to biologize a humankind. Another example. ABA, or Applied Behavioral Analysis, allegedly an effective treatment for autism. Behaviorism-informed program of reinforcement. In its early version, some years ago, it also employed deterrence. If it does extinguish certain undesirable symptoms and or reinforce others, does it thereby actually alter brain functioning? It doesn't seem unlikely. Let's consider Hacking's interactive kinds for a moment. Does his thinking here apply to any learning disorders? Well, we have the internet, scientific accounts of particular disorders, support groups, charities, advice for parents, dietary advice. Those classified in a particular way may well undergo significant changes as a result of the relevant forces in contemporary society. There may well be the kinds of looping effects that Hacking is talking about. However, let's face it, claiming that some learner classifications involve interactive kinds is controversial. So I'm going to try to resist this idea for a while. Certainly, many defenders of the dyslexia label would resist. I'm going to try to give the idea that they involve in different kinds a run for their money. That they aren't actually one of Hacking's moving targets. There's an influential way of thinking about natural kinds that involves essentialism. It may be originally due to the philosopher John Locke. It was made famous and very influential in the last century by Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam. We often classify on the basis of typical observable properties. In 1750, someone might distinguish water from oil according to taste, colour, viscosity, and so forth. As science advances, people realise that underlying aspects of the object's inner structure explain these stereotypical observable properties. For example, salt is soluble, has a certain taste, crystalline form, and colour. Its underlying chemical constitution as sodium chloride explains the surface features. Its underlying constitution is an essential property. To be salt, stuff must have this property. So salt is thought of as a natural kind. The reference of natural kind terms is not exhausted by the knowledge, understanding and intentions of the individual user of the relevant terms. It involves external factors. Thus, people using the term water in 1750, as a matter of fact, succeeded in referring to H2O. This was so even though they had no idea at that time of the nature of water's chemical constitutions. Speakers think that terms such as water are members of the same natural kind if and only if they have some underlying, though perhaps currently unknown, common property. This is the real essence of that kind. Chemical elements have some microstructural property. An object's real essence explains its outward observable features. Empirical science discovers the real essences of objects. Now, at least some contemporary thinking about learning disabilities seems to belong in this tradition. It sees those suffering from a specific learning disability as sharing some kind of neural essence. This is thought to explain their symptoms, and some conceptualizations of psychiatric disorders are similar. Now, what about ADHD as a natural kind? These researchers think it is, quote, neuropsychological intra-individual variability explains unique genetic variants of ADHD and shows suggestive linkage to chromosomes 12, 13 and 17. A quote from Frazier, Wood and others, 2012. And here's someone who thinks dyslexia is a natural kind, perhaps? John Stein, 2017, quote, thus, it is clear that we have to look more deeply at the physiological mechanisms that cause phonological difficulties. These throw up clear differences between dyslexic and typically developing readers, particularly with respect to their auditory and visual, temporal processing and sequencing. End of quote. But can such essentialist intuitions, either about psychiatric disorders or about learning disabilities, be turned into coherent beliefs? I want to explore several potential answers to this question. Persisting states, whether linked to desirable traits such as intelligence, or to deficits or dysfunctional states that may be associated with dyslexia, are sometimes associated with aspects of brain functioning. For instance, Nicholson talks of, quote, the intrinsic brain difference characteristic of dyslexia, of the neural circuits for declarative and procedural processing, and of explaining cognitive level deficits in terms of the brain structures that cause them. Difficult, interesting, and important philosophical questions arise here. What does it mean to say that a specific human trait continues to exist over time? Dyslexia would be just one rather special example. Can we directly observe a trait persisting over time? Having blue eyes is a mundane example. The colour persists, though evidently it will seem to vary according to the lighting conditions at any one moment. It may gradually fade with age. What about having a particular illness over time? We could see observable symptoms persisting over time, perhaps. Evidently, however, cases of this kind may be much less straightforward than eye colour. Symptoms often change during the progress of the illness, one set being replaced by others in typical developmental sequences. How can we secure a robust meaning of a claim that the same condition has been present over time in these cases? We need to appeal to events within the body of the sufferer. For instance, characteristic internal physiological phenomena may be causally linked to a virus. And of course, biologists will have to operate identity criteria for a virus over time. Now, identifying a condition linked to a learning disorder that persists over time is challenged by the comorbidity issue. There is extensive overlap between the symptoms of dyslexia and many other developmental disorders such as ADHD. Note two distinct meanings of comorbidity. First, symptoms may be comorbid if they can be found to overlap when we look at particular individuals. And the second sense, if we research populations rather than particular individuals, we might say that two disorders are comorbid if they correlate positively. Consider then the challenge posed by comorbidity in the first of these senses. Suppose that a permanent state, echoing in some ways the essential properties of natural kinds, could be discovered in individuals, a state apparently responsible for symptoms associated with dyslexia. That discovery could form the basis of dyslexia's nature over time. It could not only trump the difficulties associated with the overlap between its symptoms and those of other disorders, it might actually be the focus of scientific research into how the symptoms could be mitigated. A condition that does seem to model this possibility is Down syndrome. People with this condition have an extra copy of chromosome 21. Now, whether psychiatric disorders have essential properties has been widely debated by scholars from a variety of disciplines. Hacking, in commenting on DSM-5, refers to the history of classifying mental illness. He noted a botanical emphasis. On the dubious grounds that organic illness classifications resemble plant classifications, it was thought that what was good enough for organic illnesses should be splendid for psychiatric disorders. Haslam has researched the lay tendency to essentialize thinking about a whole range of phenomena. These include traits, illnesses, and psychiatric disorders. Adrians and de Bloch observe, quote, "Some patients desperately want to be labelled with a particular diagnosis and are willing to act according to the relevant diagnostic criteria. By conforming to their diagnosis, they contribute to the perception of homogeneity in the population of psychiatric patients." End of quote. Both Nicholson and Eliot, in the book Developing the Dyslexia Debate, make points that count against natural kind thinking. They refer to the complexities involved in identifying the direction of causes here, whether, that is to say, symptoms associated with struggling readers result in any straightforward fashion from pre-existing biological conditions, or whether the biological conditions can, wholly or in part, amount to consequences of certain learning experiences. Nicholson observes that, quote, "there is a legitimate question over cause versus correlate," end of quote. If causes can work in both directions, this challenges the purely essentialist account. The latter would run the causes from internal states of affairs to observable properties, as in the case of the chemical elements. In any case, are essentialist accounts just the wrong way of looking at things here? Zachar, 2000, opposes essentialist understandings of mental disorders. He claims that psychiatry employs a pragmatic approach. Labels are applied just in case a sufficiently substantial number of DSM criteria are satisfied. Satz, 1960, explored the contrasting possibility that some psychiatric disorders were associated with brain lesions of certain kinds. For him, illness had to have a biological foundation. Were the right kinds of brain lesions to be discovered, they could constitute the essence of a given disorder or illness. Though famously, Satz did not believe in such lesions and concluded that mental illness is mythical. The possibility of a lesion or the equivalent seems to sit well with currently influential ways of seeing learning disorders. Mahan comments on how learning disorders are viewed. Quote, "The dominant mode of representation is psychological cum medical. Students are diagnosed as having a learning disability, an educational handicap, attention deficit disorder, ADD, or special needs. These representations place the problem inside the child's mind or brain." End of quote. Papineau, however, used an analogy with software. He argued that there might be no type of brain damage or persisting abnormality grounding psychiatric disorders. In terms of our current discussion, no persisting neurological essence. Instead, there could be brain events akin to malfunctioning software. If my computer's software is failing to function properly, I don't peer inside my machine in the hope of uncovering the equivalent of a silicon chip lesion or silicon chip dysfunction essence. The malfunction could well be instantiated in perfectly functioning circuits. In a recent research paper, the reality of dyslexia is explained in such a way that brain functioning is clearly implicated. Yet, Papineau's software analogy possibility is left open. Quote, "Dyslexia, the disorder, seems to be the result of a subtle yet significant snarl in the brain's ability to process information about words." End of quote, from Underwood, 2013. On the one hand, the expression snarl could refer to an organic lesion. It could, on the other hand, capture a problem with brain functioning that could be helpfully compared to a software issue, as Papineau suggests. I now want to spend a few moments on the term malfunctioning. I show that it cannot be understood in a way that would fit an essentialist account of learning disorders. So, in what ways might malfunctioning be understood? When we speak of malfunctioning organs such as the heart, we refer to that which does or does not contribute to the survival of the organism. A short-term version would relate quite literally to whether the malfunction was life-threatening, while a broader interpretation could encompass biological fitness, whether the malfunction restricted the organism's capacity to reproduce. Now, these biological interpretations are not obviously applicable to a snarl, the term attached by Underwood to dyslexia. For something to have a biological function is for it to have an evolutionary history. This history explains its current existence by reference to those of its past effects. These effects have contributed to its reproductive fitness and subsequent survival and replication. Do learning disabilities affect chances of reproduction? Probably not. Sadly, some psychiatric disorders may affect reproduction chances. I think we need to appeal to social phenomena outside the head of the person to characterize fully the idea of malfunction. How might such an appeal go? One approach to naturalizing the notion of malfunction is to reference it to what is normal in the social environment of our sufferer. What is normal is to be operationalized in statistical terms. But what is normal varies from one place to another and also will change over time. Bingham and Banner, 2014, note that on a statistical basis, and considering normal in this light, homosexuality would count as dysfunctional in many societies. Some would regard this point as constituting a reductio ad absurdum of any statistical construal of dysfunction or even snarl. So, how else might we look outside the heads of learners for alternative notions of function and malfunction? I think we are concerned with the normative, the purposes that brains should fulfill. Kingma argues that, quote, a completely value-free account of health and disease cannot directly determine moral and social decision-making. We bring in the values of particular cultures, what counts as important learning, and much else. Hacking also emphasises the importance of norms in how we classify people. ADHD and dyslexia taxonomies reflect assumptions about what is normal behaviour and language processing behaviour in a wide range of contexts. The use of the ADH label relates to what behaviour is valued in classrooms and what behaviour is deemed inconvenient, hence dysfunctional. In a different culture, so-called difficulties in concentrating might be taken as a sign of intelligence in the face of a ghastly school environment. So classifications in terms of dysfunction are not independent of culture and value. And let me mention a poignant case, a couple with 2 adult sons who are severely autistic. Their mother says she has learned much from her sons about how to be human, about the point of life. This is not to deny the existence of what we find to be distressing symptoms, nor is it to assert that no learner classifications whatever can be biologized. Down syndrome would be a case in point. But at the moment we are looking outside the head to see how that informs how we categorize learners. I want to take this externalist account further. To do so, 2 key philosophical ideas are needed. Consider first the concept of the constitutive rule. In an early article, the political philosopher John Rawls distinguished between 2 kinds of rules, the regulative and the constitutive. Regulative rules include everyday rules we regularly encounter, such as drive on the left, keep off the grass, and so forth. Examples of constitutive rules are the rules of games, such as chess. The rules governing how a castle-shaped piece may be moved horizontally or vertically mean that certain actions with the piece become moving the rook actions. The rules constitute the actions concerned. The actions are what they are in virtue of the rules. The second notion we need to play with is that of collective intentionality. The American philosopher John Searle has had much to say about this. There are, everyday, individual intentions. I intend to shave this morning and to walk to work later. In addition, group intentions feature at the heart of our social reality. For example, group intentions ground the meanings of road signs and the value of a £20 note. Group intentions underlie the very existence of constitutive rules, such as those of chess. We intend that chess rules should apply worldwide. As long as we intend this, we sustain in existence those rules according to which moving that castle-shaped piece in a certain way on that 8x8 squared board just is a rook move. We intend that such and such a road sign means that you must not drive faster than 50 miles per hour, and that the £20 note has such and such a place in our economic and monetary system. Both constitutive rules and collective intentionalities are central to the functioning of language in its broadest sense. When an English speaker uses the word dog, she succeeds in saying what she intends, partly in virtue of the existence of collective intentions. It is these that sustain constitutive rules about the function of dog. If she uttered a very similar sound in a country where a language other than English was spoken, she might be credited with a different meaning. It follows from all this that the notion of a snarl in connection with the dyslexia cannot be separated conceptually and constitutively from these social phenomena in which individuals are embedded. A snarl can only be fully characterised with reference to language. The term's definition links it explicitly to a capacity to deal with words. This means, in turn, that the very conception of a snarl incorporates aspects of social reality. An assertion that a snarl exists is about both something inside a person and about their social and cultural environment. The said aspects of social reality are not fixed, of course. They will vary over time and from one social context to another. These points appear to distance conceptions of learning disorders such as dyslexia from anything exclusively inside individuals that would parallel the inner constitutions of natural kinds. In my 2008 paper, I questioned the robustness of an essentialist perspective on some of the labels currently awarded to learners, drawing on Ian Hacking's studies of kinds. Hacking explores the implications of making strong assertions about the reality of psychiatric disorders and of some learning disorders. For instance, he would like to say that there were no multiple personalities in 1955. Yet, by 1985, many were diagnosed with it. He appreciates that expressing claims in this fashion is contentious. Such ontological assertions excite controversy partly because they seem permeated with scepticism about the relevant phenomena. It is as if the conditions concerned are merely constructed by people as opposed to really existing in the light of some kind of biological grounding. Moreover, if conditions are constructed, could they be dispensed with? Let's return to our inclination to essentialize in our thinking. Adriaans and de Block, 2013, refer to a folk biology involving an essentializing mentality. This can extend its grip to ethnic groups and to types of personality. Now, does such folk thinking also get applied to learning disorders, including dyslexia and ADHD? If psychiatric and learning disorders could appropriately be conceptualized along the lines of natural kinds with essential properties, then we should be able to distinguish sharply between those with the disorders and those without. After all, either a substance is gold or it is not, depending on its inner atomic constitution. However, it is sometimes claimed in this connection that we need to be clear about the difference between so-called dimensional disorders and taxonic disorders. Dimensional disorders are characterized by the absence of clear boundaries between disorder and non-disorder. In the case of taxonic disorders, there are clear boundaries. Haslam, Holland and Coppens, 2012, argue that the majority of frequently encountered disorders are dimensional. Examples of the latter include headaches and, according to DSM-5 at least, autism, with its extended category of autism spectrum disorder, ASD, that's dimensional. A useful, clear-cut case to note here is Down syndrome, which is taxonic as far as its biological basis is concerned, yet symptoms of this disorder vary in their severity between one individual and another. Dyslexia symptoms present themselves with different levels of severity. Nevertheless, it does not immediately follow from this that dyslexia itself is a dimensional disorder. Compare it with measles, for example. Either an individual has measles or she does not. Presumably measles is a taxonic disorder, yet measles symptoms come in many strengths and sizes. Natural kinds are not dimensional. They are taxonic. Eliot claims that it is now widely accepted that reading ability and disability is dimensional. Therefore, there can be no clear-cut dyslexic, non-dyslexic distinction. Consider a classic question relating to these issues. Just how should the potential candidates for the dyslexia label be selected in the first place? You could start with what you believed was a relevant neurological feature. You might select subjects on that basis from the wider set of students with language difficulties. But how would you know what to look for in the brain? How could you know where to start? Anyhow, just suppose that you could initiate such a project. If you succeeded, you might, in effect, be constructing a taxonic feature for the dyslexia label. All this might strike you as an impossible project, and the taxonic feature an unfortunate consequence. So you could instead choose to classify as dyslexics those individuals whose difficulties are debilitating beyond a certain cut-off point. And I think that is Joe Elliott's view. If you did that, you might be building a dimensional character into the label. So you would be less than surprised at being unable to pinpoint a specific neural feature common to all those labelled in this way. Another option for labelling is to highlight a key feature of observable difficulties such as poor phonological awareness. I understand phonological awareness in the standard way as the capacity to grasp that words are made up from a variety of sounds. Again, this looks as though it would build in a dimensional character for the label. Cooper, 2010, asks important questions about what it means to say a disorder is real. At one point, she echoes J.L. Austin in his Sense and Sensibilia. We should start by specifying what possible alternatives we have in mind. Viz., what alternatives would the reality of the disorder rule out? For instance, in asking whether a disorder is real, we might be wondering whether it is tied to specific cultures or whether it is universal. Yet, observes Cooper, quote, disorders that are found only in certain places and times need not be fakes, end of quote. Even if dyslexia is not universal, but only found within certain cultures or within certain communities speaking particular languages, it would not follow from this alone that it was not real in some sense. Cooper comments that only involuntary conditions are disorders. The reality of the disorder would now be linked to the idea that it is something that happens to the individuals concerned, rather than something about which they can make choices. How, if at all, does the status of learning disorder labels matter for teaching and learning? What are the educational implications of the status of existence claims? Suppose we could make biological sense of the possibility of distinct bases for each learning disability. Then unique treatments might be needed for each one. If, for instance, dyslexia is linked to a very specific neurological phenomenon, we might devise specific treatments for it. Compare this with the medical treatment for measles and chickenpox. Imagine we want to prevent these diseases or to tackle them directly, rather than merely dealing with their symptoms. Indeed, this is exactly what we do want. We need to know about their underlying causes, viz., the characteristics of each virus and how they attack the human body. Of course, it might turn out that distinct neurological conditions might be addressed effectively by one and the same treatment, but perhaps this is unlikely. We would probably need distinctive treatments for each condition. But perhaps it makes no sense to think of specific biological essences to go with each learning disability category. Perhaps it's better to think in a broad fashion about brain abnormality. Suppose we think of learning disorders as related to observable pupil achievements. Then the comorbidity phenomenon should be uppermost in our minds. It makes sense then to look for a treatment that tackles poor achievement. We bracket off consideration of underlying causes. An analogy is where we treat the fever resulting from measles, flu and mumps. The fever might be reduced with aspirin or paracetamol, regardless of its cause. So, to conclude, there is no short, simple and coherent route from neuroscience alone to assertions that conditions such as dyslexia really exist. I'm not saying that genetics and biology are not involved in some ways. Of course they are. I'm arguing that we can't get a straightforward answer to the question, does such and such a disability really exist? My aim here, to repeat, is informed uncertainty, a grasp of at least some of the complexities here. Suppose it is true that at least some learner categories cannot aspire to the status of indifferent kinds or natural kinds. If so, the learners concerned should be regarded as belonging on a continuum with their fellows. So they should be treated accordingly. They are on a par with their fellow pupils, though their achievements may be particularly worrying. The status of the categories we apply to our learners has significant implications for how they should be treated. Awareness of all this is very important if they are to be treated fairly. I've been drawing on several of my publications: The Credentials of Brain-Based Learning, 2004, Ian Hacking, Learning Categories and Human Taxonomies, 2008, and Developing the Dyslexia Debate, 2016. I wrote a substantial endnote in this volume, and this session makes much use of that endnote. Thank you.